Hello, my name is Paul Grosswald. I'm a former member of the Church of Scientology, and I have been asked to introduce our next speaker. Now, there are many different ways for people to get involved in the cult awareness movement. Typically, somebody's a former member of a group, and then they come out of the group and they become involved in the cult awareness movement. Or perhaps somebody may have a loved one who's in a cult group, and in the process of trying to get the person out of the group, they become involved in the cult awareness movement. But our next speaker is neither of those. The way in which he became involved in this effort is somewhat unique, and he's going to tell you about it. His name is Bob Minton, and he was an investment banker, and he retired at an early age to spend more time with his family. And in his spare time, he enjoys surfing the internet. It was while traveling the information superhighway that Bob Minton came across an accident. Good Samaritan that he is, he pulled over to the side of the road and got out to help the victims. But this was no ordinary accident. In this case, the accident was the Church of Scientology, and the victims that he was helping were Scientology's critics. What happened next only goes to prove that no good deed goes unpunished. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you a man who Scientologists would probably refer to as a suppressive person, but who I refer to as a hero and a friend. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Bob Minton.
Thank you, Paul. It's truly a great honor to have been invited to speak here at the Cult Information Service Conference. First, a word about Paul. I first met Paul in March of 1996 down in Clearwater, Florida, at which time he gave a speech to a press conference following some demonstrations, picketing that we did down there against the Church of Scientology. And I couldn't believe this young man and how articulate he was and how loving his family was when they tried to get him out of Scientology and the help that they gave to him. And so I was most impressed with his story, and he was a great inspiration for me. Otherwise, there's no way in the world I'd be standing up here today. I won't be able to keep my secrets from you much longer on this point, but I'm neither a public speaker, nor do I possess any formal training on the subject of cults. However, over the last 3 years, and particularly over the course of the last 9 months, I have received a rather fiery baptism on cults and free speech from an organization that Cynthia Kisser said about is quite likely the most ruthless, the most classically terroristic, the most litigious, and the most lucrative cult the country has ever seen. No cult extracts more money from its members. Yes, as Paul mentioned, I am involved in a controversy with the Church of Scientology over what I consider to be one of the most fundamental rights in a democracy. That is, the right to speak freely. Scientology hypocritically cries that theirs is a persecuted religion attacked by bigoted and intolerant critics. Further, Scientology's mantra, repeated ad nauseum throughout their paranoid and delusional history, continues to be that those individuals and governments who dare criticize their antisocial goals, tactics, and civil rights abuses of their members are engaged in some grand conspiracy to destroy the Church of Scientology. Nothing could be further from the truth. I am just one of many people working actively through the internet, the Cult Information Service, FactNet, the American Family Foundation, and in our own individual ways to force much needed reform on Scientology. These reforms must acknowledge that all of us, particularly Scientologists, have an inalienable right to criticize, oppose, or scrutinize practices that we view as contrary to the respect and dignity required towards our fellow man. Without these most basic rights, there certainly cannot be religious freedom, or in fact any freedom in our democracy. Scientology's own creed, which uses the phrase inalienable rights 7 times, states in part that all men have inalienable rights to think freely, to talk freely, to write freely their opinions, and to counter or utter or write upon the opinions of others. These are extremely noble words that the Scientology creed holds. But this is truly an organization whose so-called leaders have no shame whatsoever. When will the hypocrisy of the Church of Scientology ever end? In the United States, many of us take our inalienable rights for granted, because by definition they cannot be taken away. But ask your own sons and daughters who have experienced Scientology's orgy of thought reform, or Paulette Cooper from New York, or Larry Wallersheim from Colorado, Stacey Young from Washington, Arnie Lerma from Virginia, or Frank Oliver from Florida, if their inalienable rights were in any way protected while in Scientology, or if Scientology, once these people left, in any way respected those rights once they departed. Ask Lisa McPherson and Noah Loddick if their right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was in any way sacred to the Church of Scientology. A little known fact in our society is that we have no rights under our Constitution unless we are willing to stand up and affirmatively assert them. This is a price all cults and litigious entities like Scientology force us to pay in our society, because they are so willing to strip their members and critics alike of as many rights as we will cede to them. Sorry. Let me tell you a little bit about personal boundaries and how an organization like Scientology tries to prey and destroy on personal boundaries of family members, friends, associates, and yes, even children, to stop the truth from being told about this organization. Before detailing Scientology's campaign of harassment and intimidation against me personally, I want to share some thoughts with you that I had in August of 1997, when I actually began to doubt some of the stories which I'd heard from critics about the incredible levels of harassment and intimidation inflicted on people by the Church of Scientology. By this time, I had given a lot of financial support to a number of critics, and some of this was clearly public knowledge. Yet I hadn't been subjected to any sort of criticism or any harassment, no threatening phone calls, nothing. I began to wonder if the people in the Church of Scientology were really as bad as these stories that I had heard from critics. I began to doubt whether critics were telling the truth, or maybe exaggerating somewhat about their experiences at the hands of Scientology.